Imagine the shadow of a tragedy so profound that it shook the most powerful empire on earth. Rome, betrayed and humiliated in the forests of Teutoburg, saw its legions annihilated and its pride shattered. But what makes Rome eternal is not the absence of defeats, but the strength to rise up and respond with overwhelming fury. This is the story of a revenge that resonated not only in Germania, but that echoed through time, changing the course of history. It is the journey of leaders who faced the pain of their losses, responded to betrayal, and marched to transform humiliation into triumph. If you've ever felt the weight of defeat or the pain of betrayal, prepare to discover how the determination of an entire empire redefined the impossible. In this epic narrative, we will delve into the battles, losses, and rebirth of Rome and learn that sometimes true victory is not conquering land, but regaining lost honor. The echo of Teutoburg still resonates. Are you ready to hear Rome's response? Before we start, tell me, have you subscribed to the channel yet? Because this is just the first in an epic series about the Roman world, full of details and curiosities that you won't want to miss. The betrayal of Arminius. It was a time of great conquests and tensions in the vastness of the Roman Empire. Under the command of Governor Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman legions advanced towards the northern borders, in Germanic lands, believing that peace was guaranteed after years of diplomacy and treaties. But in the heart of these mysterious lands, a betrayal was being hatched, a plot that would forever change the destiny of Rome. Arminius, a brilliant young German officer, was a man of respectable appearance and a sharp mind. He had received military training in Rome, gaining the trust of his superiors and learning the secrets of Roman tactics. But despite his Roman robes and his title as auxiliary commander, Germanic blood ran through his veins, and he never forgot his origins. While the Romans viewed Arminius as a loyal ally, he harbored in his heart the desire to free his homeland from foreign rule. Arminius saw the dense forests, winding rivers, and hills of his land not as territories to be conquered, but as the home of his people, a people who deserved to live free. Over the course of months, Arminius was weaving his web of deceit. He was charismatic, persuasive, and managed to gain Varus' full trust. Always present at war councils, his words sounded like those of a faithful advisor. He began to paint a picture of local revolts, assuring the governor that to crush any insurgency, Rome needed to advance in full force through the Teutoburg Forests. Varus, trusting his brilliant officer, little suspected that the promise of an easy victory was, in fact, an invitation to a deadly trap. The forests of Teutoburg were vast and treacherous, a natural labyrinth that few Romans knew well. The landscape was gloomy, with gigantic trees whose branches intertwined, creating an oppressive darkness even in daylight. The terrain was muddy, full of slopes and ditches, making it difficult for a legion accustomed to open, well-defined fields to advance. As the Roman armies marched with heavy armor and long lines of supplies, Arminius guided them. He knew the terrain well and knew exactly where to lead them. From time to time, he would wander away with the excuse of consulting local Germanic allies or checking safe routes. In effect, he was reuniting the Germanic clans, uniting once divided tribes under a common cause: the destruction of the invader. In the heart of the forests, Arminius revealed his betrayal. He led the Romans straight into a narrow gorge surrounded by trees and ravines. It was the perfect location for an ambush. When the first sounds of war echoed through the trees, screams in German, the sound of arrows piercing the air, and the crash of tree trunks falling to block the retreat, the Roman army realized too late that it had been betrayed. The Germans, with light weapons and quick movements, appeared from all sides, attacking with ferocity. They knew every bend in the terrain, while the Romans, slow and disorganized in the chaos, were an easy target. The rain began to fall, turning the ground into mud and making defense even more difficult. The Roman standards, which used to stand proudly in battle, fell one by one, as the legion was crushed in despair. Arminius observed the scene with a cold and determined look. He felt no remorse. For him, this was not just a battle. It was the liberation of his people. He had betrayed Rome, yes, but to save his land. That day, the forests of Teutoburg became the tomb of 3 Roman legions. It was a devastating blow to the pride of the empire. Quintilio Varus, overcome by shame and despair, took his own life. Arminius' name became both a curse in Rome and a symbol of resistance among the Germanic peoples. But Arminius' story does not end here. His betrayal was just the beginning of a larger struggle, a struggle that would resonate for generations, marking the boundary between two powerful cultures. In that moment, a man turned into a legend, an act of betrayal into a symbol of freedom. The massacre in Teutoburg, it was a heavy morning, the kind of day when the sky seemed to carry a dark portent. The dense forests of Teutoburg, with their colossal trees and oppressive silence, hid dangers that the Romans could not imagine. The legions, led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, marched confidently, although with difficulties. They were overloaded, carrying supplies and accompanied by civilians, creating a long, disorganized caravan that snaked through the narrow paths of the forest. In the heart of this vast and mysterious jungle, the terrain began to conspire against the Romans. The torrential rain turned the ground into mud, making the carts bog down and the soldiers slip. Each step felt heavier than the last. But still, trusting in Arminius's word, they pressed on. It was then that the sounds began. First, faint and distant, like whispers on the wind. But soon, the whispers turned into war cries that echoed through the trees. Arrows began to rain from above, appearing like ghosts from nowhere. The Romans, taken by surprise, tried to organize themselves, but the space was too narrow. Their shields formed precarious barriers, but the Germans attacked from above and from all sides, knowing every inch of the terrain. Chaos quickly ensued. The soldiers, accustomed to open plains and strategic formations, had no way to maneuver on the muddy trails and under the weight of the dense forest. They could barely see where the attacks were coming from. The Germans, on the other hand, were in their territory. With light weapons, painted faces, and quick movements, they moved like shadows among the tree trunks, attacking and retreating before the Romans had time to react. Varus himself, a man whose military career was based more on his political standing than his commanding abilities, tried to organize his troops, but the situation was beyond any control. He saw their banners fall one by one, the symbols of Rome being trampled into the mud. The morale of his legions crumbled with every arrow and every Germanic scream. The rain continued to fall, turning the battlefield into a swamp of death. The bodies of the Romans covered the ground, mixed in with their weapons and armor. The legions, which had marched confidently, now became victims of a meticulously planned trap. Arminius, the traitor, watched the destruction with determined eyes. For him, this was more than a victory. It was the liberation of their land. When the Roman resistance came to an end, Varus, overcome by despair and the shame of being the commander of such a defeat, made what many Roman leaders considered an honorable exit. He fell on his own sword, taking his own life. His death symbolized the total ruin of the 3 legions he led. There weren't many left to tell the story. Of the thousands who had marched into the forest, almost none managed to escape. As silence returned to the forests, the Germans gathered to celebrate their victory. Songs echoed through the valleys, cries of freedom and hymns of triumph. They believed that Rome, the powerful Rome that had conquered vast territories and subjugated countless peoples, would never threaten them again. The flames of the bonfires illuminated the faces of men, women, and children who saw that day the promise of a new era. For Rome, however, news of this massacre would be a devastating blow. The loss of 3 entire legions was an unprecedented humiliation. Teutoburg would become synonymous with betrayal and disaster. But for the Germans, it was the moment when the impossible happened. The giant fell, if only for a moment. This story, of glory for some and tragedy for others, would forever mark the relationship between Rome and the Germanic peoples. The massacre at Teutoburg was not just a battle. It was a watershed event, an event that would echo for generations, shaping the course of history. Pain and mourning in Rome, the news reached Rome like thunder on a clear day, something completely unexpected and devastating. It was hard to believe what the messengers brought. 3 entire legions, accompanied by their auxiliary cohorts, had been completely annihilated in the distant forests of Teutoburg. There were no significant survivors, just a handful of tormented souls who had escaped to tell the story of the destruction. In the heart of the empire's capital, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. Emperor Caesar Augustus, a man accustomed to victories and the brilliance of Roman power, was overcome by a pain that seemed greater than he could bear. It is said that upon receiving the news, he went into an inconsolable rage. His screams echoed through the halls of the palace, and in a moment of despair, he threw himself to the ground, banging his head against the walls as he cried out to the sky, "Varus, give me back my legions." It was a plea that mixed anger, sadness, and disbelief. For Augustus, who had spent decades consolidating the empire, losing men and territories just to strengthen it, the loss of 3 legions was not just a military coup, it was a blow to his soul and Rome's pride. The streets of Rome reflected the emperor's state of mind. There was an eerie silence hanging over the city, as if the air was thick with mourning. Ordinary citizens, accustomed to hearing about the glories and victories of their armies, were now faced with the terrible reality that Rome, the greatest empire in the world, had been humiliated by tribes considered barbarians. Markets were emptier, and conversations that were once full of confidence and pride were now whispered, full of fear. Women wept for their husbands and sons who had marched north, never returning. The Forum, which used to be the vibrant heart of public life, seemed a place of shadows, where faces reflected collective pain. The normally proud and confident senators and military commanders walked with their heads bowed. Some suggested immediate retaliation, but others, fearful of German power and aware of the treacherous terrain, argued that it was better to retreat and strengthen the borders. But none of the debates or strategies could erase the weight of grief. Each lost legionary represented a life dedicated to the service of Rome, and each of them carried with them the pride of their family, their city, their history. Noble and commoner families felt the impact of the loss equally. It was a tragedy that crossed all social classes. So, did you already know this story about ancient Rome? Tell us in the comments, I want to know what you think. And Augustus, even in the midst of all his power and glory, looked like a defeated man. He would have frequently retreated to his quarters, refusing to see visitors and withdrawing into profound silence. It is said that he repeated the same phrase for days, as if it were a mantra. "Varus, give me back my legions," the symbols of Rome, the eagles that adorned the lost legions, were especially painful. For the Romans, these eagles were not just war standards. They were sacred emblems, representing the invincible spirit of the empire. Knowing that the Germans now possessed these standards was an almost unbearable humiliation. Getting them back became an almost religious goal in the years that followed. But in that moment, the weight of the loss was crushing. The Teutoburg massacre marked a wound that Rome would never forget. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a reminder that even the greatest empire on earth was not invulnerable. While Augustus mourned his legions and Rome tried to pull itself together, the empire's borders were adjusted, and expansion northward was halted for years. In the collective Roman memory, that moment was recorded as an example of the price of excessive trust and betrayal. The pain was profound, but it also united the empire in a silent determination. Never forget the legions that were lost, and never underestimate the challenges of any frontier. The revenge decision, the massacre at Teutoburg, brought Rome to its knees, but not defeated. In the heart of the empire, as mourning engulfed the people and the scars of humiliation burned in their hearts, 2 figures emerged as symbols of resistance and hope. Tiberius, the experienced general and heir of Augustus, and Germanicus, a young commander whose name would echo as synonymous with courage and determination. Tiberius, a man of few words and a heart hardened by years on the battlefield, did not allow his grief to turn into despair. He knew that the answer to that tragedy was not resignation, but revenge. For him, each legionnaire lost in the Germanic forests was a reminder that the glory of Rome could not be tarnished without consequences. Thus, at a military council held in secret, Tiberius took the floor, his voice firm and full of authority. "Rome will not bow before barbarians. I swear by Mars, the god of war, that we will raise our standards and wash away this humiliation with the blood of those who dared to defy us." At his side stood Germanicus, a young man with fiery eyes and the vigor of youth, but also wisdom beyond his years. He was not just a commander, he was a leader who won hearts. His men followed him not just out of duty, but out of admiration. When Germanicus raised his voice, his soldiers felt as if the very spirit of Rome spoke through him. "We will not just fight for revenge, but for justice. The spirits of our brothers cry out for redemption. Let's show the world that Rome is not just strength, but also honor." Their determination ignited the spirits of those who had been paralyzed by fear and pain. Together, Tiberius and Germanicus began planning the campaign that would restore Rome's dignity and avenge the lost legions. But they knew that the enemy they faced was not a conventional army. The Germans did not have walls or grand cities. His strongholds were the forests, his allies were the shadows. For months, Tiberius and Germanicus studied the tactics that could defeat such an elusive enemy. Maps were drawn, strategies discussed, and Rome's best legionnaires were summoned to the undertaking. Young Germanicus, in particular, insisted on training his men to fight in difficult terrain, adapting to conditions that had doomed his predecessors. He knew it wasn't enough to want revenge. It was necessary to deserve it. As planning progressed, news of this campaign began to spread throughout Rome. The people, previously dejected, began to find hope in the promise of justice. Songs were composed in honor of the new leaders, and the names of Tiberius and Germanicus began to be whispered reverently. To many, they were not just generals. They were heroes, almost divine, destined to restore the glory of Rome. Finally, the day arrived. The legions marched, this time with firm and prepared steps, no longer blindly trusting local allies, but determined to conquer with their own forces. The weight of the mission fell on the shoulders of Tiberius and Germanicus, but they were ready. Before leaving, Germanicus swore an oath before his men. "I swear on the name of Rome that we will not rest until the stolen eagles are returned and the memory of our brothers is honored. Rome's glory will be restored." And so, with hearts full of determination and hands firmly on their weapons, the army set out. The Germanic forests, once a place of shame, would now be the stage for redemption. What was to come would not just be a war, but a demonstration of Rome's invincible spirit. Revenge was not just a matter of honor. It was a promise that no one, not even the most distant and wild lands, could challenge the power of Rome with impunity. The legions marched to the beat of their drums, each step echoing as a harbinger of the fate that awaited the Germans. Rome rose again, and the world would never forget. The preparation of the Roman army, the roar of Rome, was awakening again. After mourning and humiliation, the Eternal City rose with a determination that only an empire can carry. The decision to avenge the loss of the legions in Teutoburg was not just a military act. It was a crusade for honor, a call to Rome's greatness, a reaffirmation that its glory was eternal. Preparations began quickly. Tiberius and Germanicus, the two generals who took responsibility for this historic mission, knew that brute force alone would not be enough to triumph. The campaign would require intelligence, patience, and impeccable execution. The first task was to assemble an army worthy of Rome's greatness. Enlistments were rigorous. Each legionary chosen for this campaign was experienced, many of them veterans of other wars. They were not mere soldiers. They were battle-hardened warriors, men who had marched across deserts, crossed mountains, and faced enemies in distant lands. Each of them understood the weight of the mission. They would not just fight for territory, but to restore the empire's pride. Furthermore, Tiberius insisted on something unprecedented. He wanted not just physical strength, but also emotional resilience and tactical intelligence. Germanicus, in turn, made fiery speeches to inspire his men. He said, "You are the chosen of Rome. Each of you carries not just a sword, but the legacy of our legions, the memory of our brothers, and the power of our civilization. We will march as one body, with one heart, and bring victory home." Rome's blacksmiths worked tirelessly. Shields were reinforced with new metals, swords sharpened until they shone like the sun. New models of spears were introduced, lighter and more lethal, designed for the rapid combat that awaited them in the Germanic forests. Armor has been adjusted to offer greater mobility without sacrificing protection. In addition to individual weapons, military engineers created new war machines. Ballistas, similar to huge crossbows, were designed to fire lethal projectiles at high speed, capable of destroying German barricades and ambushes. Chariots adapted for difficult terrain were built, ensuring that the army had mobility and supplies under any circumstances. Training camps in Rome and neighboring provinces were buzzing with activity. Germanicus personally led many of the sessions, simulating real battle conditions in dense forests. He required his men to march with the full weight of their armor and weapons over long distances, preparing them for fatigue and the weight of adverse terrain. He also introduced new tactics. They learned to fight in more flexible formations, capable of adapting quickly in narrow spaces. The army was trained to work in smaller groups, operating as independent units that could attack and retreat quickly, a direct adaptation to the Germanic strategies. "You will not just be legionnaires," said Germanicus, "but shadows of Rome, moving where the enemy least expects, striking where they least imagine." The march to Germanic lands was a spectacle that marked the memory of everyone who witnessed it. The streets of Rome were packed with citizens, from the elites on the terraces of the villas to the commoners who crowded the sidewalks and walls. Women threw flowers, children shouted words of encouragement, and men clapped their hands in reverence. "Go with the gods," shouted a mother to a young soldier who marched proudly. Each departing legionnaire knew that he carried the hopes and dreams of Rome. The golden banners, representing the eagles of the legions, glittered in the sun as the army moved away from the city walls. The drums rolled like thunder, and the sound echoed off the nearby hills, as if fate itself was marching with them. When they crossed the Rhine River, which marked the border between the civilized world of Rome and the wild lands of the Germans, the army stopped for a ceremony. Germanicus knelt, raising a sword to the sky, and swore an oath in the name of all who had perished in Teutoburg. "Let this land bear witness. We will not rest until the eagles of Rome return to their place. May every step we take be guided by honor and justice." The legions then shouted in unison, their cries echoing through the forest. And so, the crusade began. A renewed army, guided by honor, marched to recover what had been lost and show the world that although grief had shaken Rome, its resolve remained unbreakable. The winds of the Germanic forests carried a warning. Rome was returning, and this time she would not accept another defeat. Germanicus's new onslaught, the dense Germanic forests, which had once swallowed Rome's legions, would now be the scene of a new attempt at conquest. But this time, the scenario was different. Under the command of the young and brilliant Germanicus, the Roman army was prepared to face not only visible enemies, but also the challenges of treacherous nature that stood like an invisible barrier. The march began to the sound of drums and the war cries of the legions. Germanicus, mounted on his horse, led the vanguard, his eyes fixed on the horizon. As the army entered the forests, the air seemed to change. The sunlight barely penetrated the treetops, creating shadows that danced and seemed alive. For many soldiers, the place was more than a battleground. It was a territory haunted by the spirits of the companions who had perished there. Germanicus, however, showed no fear. He knew the history of these lands, but he also knew that every step they took was an affirmation that Rome was not. Before continuing with the story, a quick reminder. Have you already liked this video? This helps YouTube spread our content to more Roman history fans like you. It's simple and free. The cost? Now, let's go back to Rome. Would curve. He made a point of walking among his men, talking to them, encouraging them. These trees may look threatening, but remember, we are Rome. No matter where we are, we bring civilization with us. Let's show these barbarians that fate is on our side. To avoid ambushes on dry land, Germanicus ordered part of the army to advance along the rivers in specially built boats. It was an innovative tactic for the Germanic scenario. Roman boats cut through the murky waters with dexterity, carrying supplies and troops to strategic positions. Rivers, however, were not easy allies. The currents were treacherous, and the banks often hid enemies ready to attack. On one occasion, While they were sailing through a narrow stretch, arrows began to rain from the trees. Germanicus, without hesitation, ordered an immediate counteroffensive. His archers responded, firing into the highest branches, while the soldiers on land ran to protect the vessels. The young general, without ever abandoning his men, positioned himself at the front line, shouting orders clearly and firmly. His presence was an anchor amid the chaos, and the confidence he inspired in his soldiers made them repel the attack quickly. As they advanced deeper into Germanic territory, the swamps became an unavoidable challenge. The terrain was treacherous, with areas that seemed firm but sank under the weight of the soldiers. Horses got bogged down, carts got stuck, and progress was painfully slow. Germanicus, however, had foreseen these difficulties. He ordered wooden walkways to be built over the most treacherous stretches, a task that required patience and skill but guaranteed the army's safety. While his men worked, Germanicus walked among them, encouraging them and reminding them of the greater goal. Every step we take here is a step toward restoring Rome to its glory. No difficulty will be great enough to stop us. Even with the preparations, the swamps were not without danger. One night, while the troops were resting, the Germans attacked under cover of darkness and fog. The confrontation was fierce, with men fighting in almost impossible conditions, slipping in the mud and trying to maintain their balance while wielding their weapons. Germanicus, as always, was at the center of the action, guiding his men and repelling enemies with quick and precise strategies. The challenges imposed by nature were not the only obstacles. The Germanic tribes, knowing the terrain well, used guerrilla tactics, attacking and retreating, trying to wear down the Romans. But Germanicus was a brilliant strategist. He used bait to lure enemies into carefully planned traps and responded with full force when ambushed. One day, upon realizing that a Germanic group was hiding on a nearby hill, Germanicus ordered his men to pretend to retreat. When the Germans came out of hiding to attack, they were surrounded by strategically positioned troops. The victory was decisive, and the morale of the legions grew. At the end of each day, Germanicus gathered his officers to plan the next steps. He was tireless, reviewing maps, studying enemy movements and predicting possible ambushes. But he also made a point of connecting with his soldiers. At night, he sat with them around the fires, listening to their stories and sharing their worries. "You are more than soldiers," he said. "You are the living force of Rome. Together, there is no obstacle we cannot overcome." Each day of advance was a victory against nature and the enemy. The forests that had been the scene of defeat now became symbols of resistance and redemption. Germanicus was determined to reach the heart of Germanic territory, recover the lost standards, and show the world that Rome would not bow down to anyone. Germanicus's new onslaught was more than a military campaign. It was an epic journey of overcoming, courage, and leadership. And as the legions advanced, the echo of their marches told the world that Rome's glory was being restored, one step at a time. In Dorota de Segestes, in the turbulent lands of the Germanic tribes, the name of Segestes was known both for his wisdom and his cautious stance towards Rome. He was not like the other tribal leaders who blindly joined Arminius, driven by the fervor of freedom. Segestes, astute and thoughtful, saw beyond the immediate enthusiasm. He had warned the Romans of Arminius' treachery, but his warnings were ignored. Now, after the massacre at Teutoburg, Segestes was in a delicate position, caught between his own people and the Romans. When Arminius led the Germanics against Rome, Segestes remained on the sidelines, reluctant to support a war that he believed would bring only destruction. He saw Arminius as a dangerous man, whose charisma hid an uncontrolled ambition. But in resisting Arminius, Segestes became the target of his fury and was imprisoned by his own people. For Arminius, Segestes was a traitor, someone who put the unity of the Germans at risk. Segestes, now a prisoner, was in a tribal fortress surrounded by warriors loyal to Arminius. Even in captivity, he did not give in to pressure. He knew his position was risky, but he believed his alliance with Rome might offer a chance to reverse the course of events. As Germanicus advanced through the forests and rivers, he learned of Segestes' situation. Informants reported that the Germanic leader was imprisoned and that his release could be a strategic blow against Arminius. Germanicus, recognizing the value of this opportunity, organized an operation to rescue him. The attack was quick and accurate. Under the darkness of night, the Roman legions surrounded the fortress where Segestes was imprisoned. Despite being outnumbered, the Romans advanced with relentless discipline. The Germans protecting the fortress were taken by surprise. Torches illuminated the battle. The sound of swords and shields echoed in the night, and Germanicus' commanding shouts pierced the air. Segestes, hearing the commotion, knew immediately that it was the Romans who had arrived. When the gates were broken down, he was found chained, but still with a steady gaze. Germanicus personally ordered his release and received him with respect. "Segestes, you warned us when no one else did," Germanicus said. "Your wisdom will now be a weapon against our common enemy." The alliance between Segestes and the Romans was a direct blow to the morale of the Germanic tribes. Many of Arminius' allies began to question his leadership. Segestes, now under Roman protection, became a powerful propagator of distrust among the Germanic clans. He knew the internal divisions of the tribes and knew how to exploit them. Furthermore, Segestes provided Germanicus with valuable information about Arminius' strategies and the Germanic weaknesses. He revealed secret routes, hidden fortresses, and the methods Arminius used to keep the tribes together. With this information, Germanicus was able to plan surgical attacks, gradually but decisively weakening Arminius' strength. Segestes' release was more than a rescue. It was a symbol of Roman determination to face and overcome challenges. Arminius himself was furious when he learned of the alliance between Segestes and the Romans. He saw this as a double betrayal, first against the Germans and second against him personally. Meanwhile, Segestes continued to undermine support for Arminius, using his influence to persuade other tribes to reconsider their loyalty. He spoke openly about how the war was leading the Germans to destruction and how an alliance with Rome could bring stability and prosperity. "Arminius led us to victory once, but now he leads us into the abyss," Segestes told the tribal leaders. "Rome may be harsh, but it is fair. With them, we have a future. With Arminius, we have only war and ruin." Germanicus recognized the value of Segestes not only as an informant, but as a symbol that Rome could be fair and inclusive towards those who chose the path of alliance. He treated Segestes with respect and ensured that his family was protected, further strengthening the trust between them. The defeat of Segestes at the hands of Arminius turned, ironically, into a victory for Rome. His presence on the Roman side weakened German unity and sowed the seeds of doubt among Arminius's allies. With Segestes at his side, Germanicus advanced deeper and deeper into Germanic territory, certain that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. Rome, even in the darkest forests, proved that its strength lay not only in its weapons, but also in its wisdom in transforming enemies into allies. Encounter with the remains of the lost legions, the forests of Teutoburg, a place where sunlight could barely penetrate the dense canopy of trees, became a land filled with dark memories. For the Romans now marching under Germanicus, this was more than a battlefield. It was a sanctuary of pain, a place where Rome's pride had been broken. As they advanced along the trail that led them to the site of the historic defeat, a heavy silence enveloped the troops. Each step was accompanied by the expectation of what they would find. The first signs appeared subtly, but soon became unmistakable. Fragments of rusted armor, broken spears, and cracked shields lay scattered across the ground, half buried in the mud and leaves that had accumulated over the years. The soldiers, upon seeing these remains, lowered their heads in respect and pain. As they approached the epicenter of the battle, the scene became more macabre. Human bones emerged from the wreckage, mixed with the remains of war horses. Some skulls still bore marks of violent blows, visible reminders of the desperate struggle that had taken place there. Roman shields lay next to makeshift altars, erected by the Germans as macabre trophies to celebrate their victory. The eagles of the legions and the sacred banners that symbolized the heart of each Roman unit were absent. Their loss, as symbolic as the destruction of the men who carried them, still echoed like an open wound in the soul of Rome. When Germanicus arrived at the scene, He dismounted his horse and walked among the wreckage. He watched silently, his face reflecting a mixture of sadness, indignation, and determination. It wasn't just a lost battlefield. It was a cemetery of honor, a cruel reminder of how Rome had been betrayed and humiliated. The officers at his side awaited instructions, but Germanicus was slow to speak. He knelt beside a broken shield, running his fingers over the corroded metal, and finally raised his voice. "Here, brothers, is where our companions fell, not as defeated, but as heroes, fighting until their last breath for the glory of Rome. May this vision rekindle in each of us the fire of revenge and the desire for justice." His words, full of emotion, reverberated among the soldiers. Many held their weapons tighter, as if silently renewing their oath of loyalty to the empire and the memory of those who had fallen. Germanicus knew that leaving the remains of his companions scattered was a dishonor he could not tolerate. He ordered that all the bones be gathered and a large mass grave dug. It was not only an act of respect, but also a symbol that, even in death, the Romans honored their own. The soldiers worked in silence, carefully collecting the bones and placing them in Roman robes before carrying them to the burial site. Some found pieces of armor or weapons that belonged to friends or relatives. These moments were deeply moving, and silent tears ran down the hardened faces of men who rarely showed weakness. As the sun set, a ceremony was held. Germanicus, standing in front of the ditch, spoke in a voice that echoed both pain and determination. "May these men be remembered not for their defeat, but for their courage. Let their souls know that we will not rest until Rome's honor is restored." The soldiers, with their fists clenched on their chests, repeated an oath in unison. "For Rome, we will avenge our brothers." The ceremony not only honored the dead, but also rekindled an unwavering determination in the living. Grief gave way to controlled fury, an energy that Germanicus channeled into his army. He knew that the memory of that place would be a powerful weapon against discouragement, a constant source of motivation for the challenges that lay ahead. Before leaving the place, Germanicus ordered that a small monument be erected with the words, "Here rest the sons of Rome, who fought to the end for the eternal glory of the empire." As they departed, the legions left the forests of Teutoburg with a renewed spirit. Each soldier carried with him the memory of that day, not as a weight, but as a flame that burned in his heart. They knew they were marching for revenge, not just for the glory of Rome, but for the souls of those who had fallen before them. The encounter with the remains of the lost legions was not just a physical event, but a spiritual milestone for Germanicus' army. He turned grief into strength, despair into determination. And as the Romans advanced deeper into Germanic territory, each step was guided by the silent promise that the tragedy of Teutoburg would never be forgotten, and that Rome's justice would be merciless. The bloody battles, what did you think of the story? Was there a character or detail that impressed you the most? Share in the comments. I want to hear your ideas. The Germanic forests, with their dense shadows and treacherous terrain, became the scene of a series of battles that would test not only the physical strength of the Roman legions, but also their resilience and strategy. Germanicus, with his steady gaze and brilliant mind, led an army determined to regain the glory of Rome. They faced not only the Germanic warriors, led by the cunning Arminius, but also nature itself, which seemed to conspire against them at every turn. Germanicus's army marched carefully along a trail that bordered a winding river, surrounded by tall trees and thick vegetation. Arminius, knowing the terrain like the back of his hand, set up an ambush. Suddenly, arrows began to rain from the trees, and Germanic war cries echoed everywhere. Germanicus, however, was prepared. He had instructed his troops to maintain a tight formation, with shields raised to protect against surprise attacks. As the Germans tried to disorganize the Roman line, Germanicus ordered his archers to fight back, aiming for the shadows of the trees. He then divided his forces into small groups, allowing them to pursue the Germans across the terrain, forcing them to retreat. Although the confrontation was brutal and many soldiers fell, the Romans managed to turn the tide. The enemy was repelled, and Germanicus distinguished himself by personally leading an attack that dismantled Arminius' forces that day. This first confrontation showed the Germans that Rome had learned from its past mistakes. Days later, the armies faced each other again, this time in an open field where Arminius had gathered a large force. He was confident that his numerical superiority and the fervor of his warriors would prevail. Germanicus, however, knew that it was there that he could make the most of the discipline of the Roman legions. Before the battle, Germanicus walked among his troops, looking each man in the eye and speaking to them in a firm, inspiring tone. Today, we face an enemy that relies on chaos and numbers. But we are Rome. Strength lies in our discipline, in our unity. Fight not only for yourselves, but for the brothers who fell before you. Today, we show the world what it means to be a legionnaire. The battle was intense. The Germans attacked in furious waves, but the Romans maintained their formations, advancing meticulously. The Roman cavalry, led by experienced officers, outflanked the Germans, creating confusion in their lines. Germanicus remained at the center of the action, coordinating movements with precision and motivating his men not to retreat. After hours of fighting, the Germans began to retreat. The field, now marked by blood and the echo of screams, became a testament to Roman determination. The victory was decisive and further strengthened the morale of the legions. Arminius, realizing he needed to change his strategy, retreated to a fortress hidden deep in the forest. He believed that the complicated terrain and natural barriers would protect his people. However, Germanicus was not a commander who accepted challenges as insurmountable. Using information provided by suggests, Germanicus surrounded the fortress. He ordered war machines to be built to break through defensive barriers. Ballistae launched huge projectiles that destroyed parts of the walls, while mobile towers allowed legionaries to scale the defenses. The battle inside the fortress was chaotic. The Germans fought with the desperation of those defending their home, but the Romans were relentless. Germanicus led a direct offensive, and, after hours of fighting, the fortress fell. It was a victory that shook Arminius's confidence and further weakened his position among the Germanic tribes. In each confrontation, Germanicus showed not only strength but also cunning. He knew that the enemy depended on geography to compensate for technical inferiority, so he set about destroying their strategic advantages. Passages were opened in the forests to allow greater mobility for the legions, and supplies were carefully protected to prevent ambushes. Furthermore, Germanicus used the disunity among the Germanic tribes to his advantage. He sent messages to dissatisfied leaders, offering protection and alliance in exchange for neutrality or support. Little by little, the siege against Arminius closed. The battles were bloody, and losses were inevitable. But with each victory, the Roman army gained more confidence. The soldiers, even though exhausted, looked to Germanicus as a leader who not only guided them, but also fought alongside them. He was the embodiment of the determined, resilient, and relentless Roman spirit. At the end of each battle, Germanicus made a point of gathering his men and honoring the fallen. He knew that every life lost was a sacrifice for the glory of Rome, and he promised his men that this sacrifice would not be in vain. Every victory we achieve here is a message. Rome will not be defeated. We are the force that shapes the world, and no one can erase our legacy. The consecutive victories began to erode Arminius's influence. His allies questioned him, and many began to desert. Germanicus knew that the war was not yet over, but he also felt that the moment of Rome's redemption was near. The bloody battles were more than just clashes of weapons. They were proof that the spirit of Rome was indomitable. Every fight, every loss, and every victory paved the way for what would be the final chapter of this epic campaign. The triumph on the Weser River. The River Weser snaked through the heart of the Germanic lands, its banks flanked by vast forests and open fields. There, among the shadows of the trees and the glittering shine of the waters, a confrontation was about to take place that would define not only the fate of Rome and the Germans, but also Germanicus' legacy as a general. News that Arminius had gathered his forces for a decisive confrontation quickly reached Germanicus. The young commander knew that this moment would be the climax of his campaign. For the Romans, that battle was more than a war. It was a chance to erase the stigma of Teutoburg, to restore the empire's wounded pride. For the Germans, it was the last opportunity to protect their freedom against the overwhelming force of Rome. On the banks of the Weser, Germanicus set up his camp. He spent days studying the terrain and the movements of Arminius, who had chosen the location carefully. The Germanic general had positioned his forces in a valley close to the river, surrounded by slopes that offered strategic advantages. It was a place reminiscent of the Teutoburg disaster, but Germanicus knew that his army was now better prepared. The night before the battle, Germanicus gathered his most experienced commanders and soldiers to outline his strategy. He spoke with conviction. "Tomorrow, we face not only Arminius and his men, but also the shadows of our past. This river will be a witness to our redemption. Fight with the strength of Rome in your hearts and with the memory of our brothers who fell before you." Meanwhile, Arminius was also making his preparations. He knew that his forces were outnumbered and that many tribes no longer shared the same fervor for his cause. Still, he was determined to fight. Stung by the loss of allies and mounting Roman pressure, Arminius trusted in the courage of his warriors and their ability to use the terrain to his advantage. As the sun rose over the river Weser, the sound of Roman drums filled the air. The legions, organized in impeccable formation, advanced with firm steps. Ahead, Germanicus rode, his presence inspiring confidence and determination. On the other side, the Germans waited in hiding, ready to ambush the Romans as they advanced through the valley. The battle began with a charge by the Romans towards the center of the Germanic forces. Arminius, realizing Germanicus' intention to break through his main lines, ordered his archers to attack. Arrows rained down on the Romans, but the erected shields absorbed much of the impact. In response, Germanicus ordered his ballistae to fire at the slopes, dislodging the Germanic archers from their positions. The hand-to-hand fighting was intense. The Germans, armed with axes and spears, attacked with ferocity, while the Romans, protected by their armor and organized in compact formations, advanced like an impenetrable wall. The clash of weapons and the shouts of combatants filled the field, while the river Weser, calm and indifferent, flowed alongside. Germanicus knew he needed to break Arminius's terrain advantage. He ordered his cavalry to outflank the Germans, attacking them from the sides and forcing them to abandon their strategic positions. The maneuver was executed with precision, destabilizing Arminius' forces. Meanwhile, in the center of the battlefield, Germanicus personally led his troops. He fought alongside his men, wielding his sword skillfully and shouting words of encouragement. Their presence at the heart of the fighting was a symbol of Rome's strength and determination. Arminius, on the other hand, did not give in easily. He commanded his forces cunningly, organizing quick counterattacks and trying to exploit any weakness in the Roman formation. In a moment of tension, he led a direct attack against Germanicus, but was repelled. During the confrontation, Arminius was injured, and his strength began to disintegrate. By the end of the day, the battlefield was covered in blood and debris. The Germanic forces, weakened and disorganized, began to retreat. Arminius, realizing that the battle was lost, withdrew with the survivors, disappearing into the forests. The victory belonged to Rome. Germanicus, although exhausted, raised his standard beside the river Weser. He ordered that the Roman dead be buried with honors and that a monument be erected to celebrate the victory. He knew this moment was more than a military victory. It was the restoration of Rome's honor. Today, the shadow of Teutoburg has been dispelled. Rome has risen again, and its glory is stronger than ever, Germanicus declared to his men. Although wounded and defeated, Arminius had not been captured. He fled deep into the Germanic lands, where he continued to lead a fragmented resistance. Many of his allies had deserted, but Arminius remained determined to fight against Roman rule. For Germanicus, the victory on the Weser was a milestone. He knew that although Arminius was still alive, his ability to unify the Germanic tribes had been severely weakened. The triumph on the Weser not only restored Rome's honor, but also solidified Germanicus's legacy as one of the greatest military leaders of his era. A strategic withdrawal from Rome, the victory on the river Weser echoed as a glorious triumph throughout the Roman army. After years of bloody fighting and sacrifices, Germanicus and his legions had defeated Arminius and reaffirmed the power of Rome. However, while the banks of the river witnessed the glow of victory, the Roman high command faced a harsh reality. The conquest and maintenance of the Germanic lands would be too heavy a burden for the empire. Germanicus, even though he was a visionary and victorious commander, was also a pragmatic strategist. He understood that every victory in the Germanic forests required an immense cost not only in lives but also in resources and morale. The Germanic territories, vast and wild, were an inhospitable labyrinth that made control and administration difficult. As he toured the battlefield after the victory on the Weser, Germanicus contemplated the landscape that now belonged to silence. He knew that Rome could subdue any enemy on the battlefield, but conquering the heart of those lands was a never-ending struggle. "We fight with honor. We restore the glory of Rome and avenge our dead," said Germanicus to his officers. "But this land, with its forests and swamps, cannot be governed like the provinces we know. Rome has already won. Now we must act wisely." At the same time, in Rome, the position of Emperor Tiberius also influenced the decision to withdraw. He, more cautious and calculating than Germanicus, saw the maintenance of a permanent occupation in Germania as a distraction from the true interests of the empire. Roman resources were limited, and Tiberius believed that consolidating existing borders was more valuable than expanding them. Messengers brought the order to retreat to Germanicus, and, although he understood the reasons, he felt the weight of the decision. For many soldiers, leaving those lands without consolidating an occupation seemed like a veiled surrender. Germanicus, however, knew that they were not running away. They had restored Rome's honor and sent a clear message. The empire was invincible. The retreat was meticulously planned. Germanicus ordered his troops to dismantle all camps and fortifications, burning any supplies that could not be taken to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. But before he left, he ensured that the memory of the Roman soldiers who had perished in the campaign was honored. In the clearing where the legions had found the remains of Teutoburg's troops, Germanicus led a last ceremony. He spoke with a voice full of emotion and pride. "We marched into these lands to avenge our brothers, and now we depart with their souls in peace. Every step we took here was a testament to Rome's indomitable spirit. We left not as defeated, but as victorious, with the certainty that this land will never again see the same shine as its victories against us." The soldiers, with shields raised and swords drawn, shouted in unison, "Rome invincible!" The journey back to Roman territory was marked by a mix of feelings. There was pride in victory, but also the awareness that Germania would remain a wild and uncontrollable land. However, the men knew that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The legions had avenged the dead, rescued the lost standards, and demonstrated that, even in the face of betrayal and adversity, Rome was capable of rising again. When Germanicus and his troops crossed the Rhine, the symbolic border between the Roman and Germanic worlds, they were greeted with celebrations. Civilians laid flowers, and high-ranking officers came to honor the soldiers. For the people, Germanicus was more than a general. He was a hero who had recovered the dignity of the empire. Rome's strategic withdrawal was not seen as a defeat, but as a calculated decision by an empire that knew how to choose its battles. Germanicus's campaign went down in history as an example of courage and leadership, a lesson that victory does not always lie in conquering lands, but in restoring honor. Arminius, injured and with his resistance fragmented, remained in the Germanic forests, but his strength was never the same. He spent the remainder of his life trying to unify the tribes again, but the impact of Germanicus's victories had sown seeds of distrust among the Germanics, preventing a powerful new coalition. For Rome, the withdrawal consolidated the Rhine as a definitive and secure border. It was a reminder that the empire, even without controlling all of Germania, remained untouchable. The legions marched back to their cities, with heads held high and the certainty that their mission had been accomplished. Before saying goodbye to his troops, Germanicus made a speech that would echo for generations. "Soldiers of Rome, you have faced the darkest challenges and emerged triumphant. Germania does not belong to us, but it also no longer belongs to fear. You have etched your names in history, not only as conquerors, but as restorers of honor. We will march home not as fugitives, but as heroes." And so the legions left the Germanic lands, not with a feeling of failure, but with the pride of having won where many had fallen. Rome had shown the world that, even in the face of the most brutal adversity, its spirit was unbreakable. The end of Arminius deep in the Germanic forests, the once glorious Arminius, the leader who had united the tribes to challenge the mighty Roman Empire, now stood alone. The man who had orchestrated the ambush in Teutoburg and humiliated Rome lived his last days surrounded by the shadow of betrayal and isolation. His rise to the status of Germanic hero had been rapid, but his fall would be even more cruel. After his defeat on the banks of the river Weser, Arminius' leadership began to be questioned by the very Germanic tribes he had once united. The dream of a free and unified Germania, which once inspired so many, now seemed distant and unreal. Many tribal leaders who had initially followed Arminius fervently began to doubt his ability to definitively defeat Rome. The constant presence of Roman legions on the borders, the military power of Germanicus, and the successive blows dealt against the Germanic forces created a climate of distrust. To make matters worse, Arminius' own methods, often harsh and authoritarian, alienated those who once supported him. The Germans, a people accustomed to the independence of their tribes, began to see in Arminius not a liberator, but a man who aspired to absolute power. The betrayal began as a whisper among the tribe's leaders. For many, Arminius had become a symbol of division, an obstacle to peace and stability. His insistence on continuing the fight against Rome, even after devastating losses, was seen by some as stubbornness, an unnecessary sacrifice of lives in the name of an ideal that no longer seemed possible. Arminius, although he noticed the growing distrust around him, refused to back down. He still believed in the cause he defended. Even weakened and surrounded by internal enemies, his spirit remained indomitable. He sought to unite the tribes again, but the fragmented resistance he led was crumbling. Among the tribal leaders who once followed him, a group began to conspire against him. They feared that as long as Arminius was alive, the war against Rome would never end and their tribes would continue to suffer the consequences. The day of his death arrived as suddenly as it was inevitable. At a meeting with tribal leaders, Arminius was confronted by those who had plotted against him. Harsh words were exchanged. Accusations flew around the makeshift hall, and the tension became unbearable. Then, without warning, a sword was drawn. Arminius tried to defend himself, but those who betrayed him were many. He fell to the blows of his own men, betrayed by those who had once sworn loyalty. His blood stained the forest floor he had fought so hard to protect. Arminius, the leader who had challenged the world's greatest empire and inspired a people, died an abandoned and betrayed man. His death was not accompanied by glory or celebration, but by silence and resentment. For the Germans, it symbolized the definitive collapse of unified resistance against Rome. Although his death marked the end of his leadership, Arminius' name was never forgotten. He became a complex figure in history. For some, a hero who dared to defy Rome. For others, a leader whose ambition and rigidity led to ruin. The news of his death reached Rome with a whisper of relief. For the empire, Arminius's absence meant the end of a significant threat. Without his charismatic leadership, the Germanic tribes once again became fragmented, unable to form a united front against Rome. For Germanicus, who had faced Arminius in so many battles, his death was a symbolic milestone. He knew that German resistance would never be the same. Arminius was the heart and soul of the movement, and with his death, the flame of rebellion was all but extinguished. The murder of Arminius also brought a clear lesson. Unity based on the strength and charisma of one man is fragile. His story became a warning to those who sought to lead through absolute power, especially in a world where alliances could change as quickly as the winds. Despite his betrayal and downfall, Arminius remained a symbol to the Germans, a reminder of what could have been. And for Rome, he was both a feared enemy and a respected adversary. His death marked the end of an era of fierce resistance and the beginning of a long period of relative stability on the Rhine frontiers. Thus ended Arminius's journey, not in triumph, but in tragedy. However, his story continued to echo in the Germanic forests and in the halls of Rome. He was the man who united rival tribes, challenged the most powerful empire in the world, and paid the ultimate price for his ambition. His death was a final chapter, but his legacy, like all great leaders, continued to inspire generations. The legacy of Roman revenge. The forests of Germania had witnessed blood, glory, and betrayal, but now silence returned to those lands. Rome's revenge had been fulfilled, and although the territory had not been completely conquered, the empire had restored its honor. The campaign led by Germanicus left deep marks, not only on the battlefield, but also on the soul of the empire and the history of the Germanic tribes. With the end of unified resistance and the death of Arminius, Rome had to decide what to do with Germania. The vast forests, treacherous swamps, and restless tribes made it impossible to maintain a permanent occupation without exorbitant cost. The ever-calculating Emperor Tiberius determined that the Rhine frontier would suffice as a natural and military barrier. For Rome, it was not a surrender, but a strategic decision. Germania, although free from direct domination, now knew what it meant to face Rome's fury. The message was clear. The empire would not tolerate betrayal or challenges to its supremacy. The Germanic tribes, fragmented and without a leader like Arminius, understood that the shadow of the empire would always hang over them. When Germanicus and his legions crossed the Rhine again, this time returning to Roman territory, they were received as heroes. The news of his victories and the rescue of the honor of the legions lost in Teutoburg had reached all parts of the empire. Wherever they went, the soldiers were greeted with applause, flowers, and shouts of exultation. In Rome, the celebration was grand. Triumphal parades took to the streets, with Germanicus at the front, riding a white horse, a symbol of victory and purity. Behind him, soldiers carried the recovered banners of the lost legions, the same ones that had been taken by the Germans years before. Those banners, dirty and worn, now shone again as symbols of redemption. The people acclaimed Germanicus as a hero, comparing him to the great leaders of the past. He was seen not only as a victorious general, but as a restorer of Roman pride. The songs composed in his honor echoed throughout the empire, and his name became synonymous with courage and leadership. Rome is eternal, and its glory will never be erased, declared the orators in the squares, extolling the achievements of Germanicus and his men. But behind the celebrations, there was also the memory of the cost of revenge. Thousands of soldiers had lost their lives in the German forests and fields. Each victory was accompanied by blood and sacrifice. Germanicus, although admired, carried the weight of these losses in his heart. He frequently visited the monuments erected in honor of the fallen, where soldiers' families came to mourn and pay respect. In a speech before one of these monuments, Germanicus spoke sincerely. "This victory is not mine, but that of every man who fought and fell for Rome. May your sacrifice never be forgotten, and may your memory guide us to a future of strength and unity." Germanicus' words deeply touched those who heard him. He was not just a military leader. He was someone who understood the pain of war and who honored the price of glory. With the strategic withdrawal, Rome strengthened its defenses along the Rhine. Fortresses were built and garrisons reinforced. This border became not only a physical barrier, but also a symbol of Rome's power. The Germans, although free in their lands, never again dared to launch an attack as bold as Arminius's. Constant surveillance along the Rhine became a key part of Roman military strategy. Experienced legions patrolled the area, and the imposing presence of Roman eagles reminded the Germans that, although free, they were under the watchful eye of the empire. The name of Germanicus became eternal. He was seen as the man who not only avenged the legions, but who also restored confidence in Rome as an invincible power. His return was celebrated, but he never boasted about his achievements. Instead, he used his position to promote unity within the empire and strengthen its defenses. For the Roman people, Germanicus was more than a general. He was a symbol of resilience. He had shown that, even in the face of the greatest adversity, Rome would always find a way to rise again. His legacy inspired generations of soldiers and leaders, becoming a reference for courage and leadership in times of crisis. The legacy of Roman revenge was a mixture of triumph and lesson. Although the lands of Germania were never completely conquered, Germanicus's campaign reaffirmed Rome's strength and its determination to defend its honor. The history of revenge showed that the empire was not just a set of territories, but an idea, a symbol of civilization, order, and strength. The forests of Germania remained, but so did Rome, and the echo of Germanicus's words resonated like an eternal reminder. Rome is more than a place. It is a force that will never be destroyed. Thanks for watching this far. Have you already subscribed to the channel? Don't forget, because there are many more incredible Roman stories to come. See you in the next video.